Good afternoon to our October New Economy Shortcut on a very important subject and a topic that we would like to focus on in the next couple of months, especially next year. Also in the run-up of the US elections, where one big question will be if Joe Biden and what sometimes is already called Bidenomics will be strong enough to counter the comeback of Donald Trump probably, and so maybe a new period of populism. And at the same time, we are living through a period where the AfD in Germany is going up in the polls, and there's a whole debate in Europe about immigration, about how to react to people's desire to find solutions, or the unrest in a way or another to populist vote. In this context, I think it's extremely important to continue work that we have started to do some years ago when we started with, especially with Robert Gold, who's with us now, on the first reasons of populism. What is behind this populism, which has come up in the US, in the UK, in other countries, which is an international phenomenon. And then, while still trying to better understand the reasons for populism, for populist votes, try to design policies that could address these factors. And that's in the midst of what Robert has been started to do and has worked on, and which is what we want to listen to now today. David will present Robert and the studies that we're going to continue afterwards.
Hey, yeah, we are very happy to welcome Robert Gold, who is the deputy head at the Institute for the World Economy in Kiel. And in his research, he focuses on the political economy of populism, in particular with respect to globalization and technological change. And we are especially happy that you will present this paper today here with us, because it fits very well in its logic with the work you have already done for the forum. Over the last years, Robert has contributed already 2 studies for the forum. And just as a short introduction, I would just a very short recap of the findings of these 2 studies. The first one in 2019 was together with Timo Fetzer, and was a basic first summary on the drivers of populism. And you found that economic factors are the most important, with economic shocks coming from the financial crisis, globalization, and technological change increased inequality between different groups, and also therefore fostered distributional conflicts, which were then amplified by immigration or austerity policies. So economic factors most important, but also cultural factors very relevant. This feeling of left behind and anxieties about the future, which were then exploited by populist parties. So the first basic paper on the drivers of populism was then complemented by a second paper published in 2022. And this looked more on the policy side. So what can the policymakers do against populism? And you found that creating development perspectives for regions and individuals which were left behind is the main policy challenge. And a second point you mentioned, or you've stressed, that not only welfare policies are not enough, so mere redistribution, but they should also be complemented with labor market policies, such as the creation of good jobs. And so that's why we are very happy that with this new paper, you basically empirically test your claim from your paper before. Yeah, it's an empirical test basically of this prescribed policy proposals, especially regional politics in the EU. And so with this short introduction, I hand over to you, Robert, who will tell us whether we can pay off populism in Europe.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me, and thank you all for joining. Let me share my screen. I can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So this is a joint research project with Jakob Lehr, who is at the University of Mannheim. And the project is very much motivated by this sign. Perhaps not specifically this single sign here, but whenever the European Union invests into regional development projects, they put up these signs to explain that European funds are used here for regional development policies. And most obviously, the European Union must have the idea that they can achieve some goal with that. And Jakob and I, we really had a longer discussion on whether it pays off for the European Union to do so. So on the one hand, one could imagine that that the support for the European project increases, that people see that the European Union does something for their region. On the other hand, we know from the Brexit referendum that it's particularly those regions who benefit a lot from European structural funds were most supportive of leaving the European Union. So it's pretty much an open question what consequences, what political consequences these signs actually have. Unfortunately, we do not have information on the signs, but we can look at the underlying investments, specifically from the European Regional Development Fund, and we investigate whether they increase or decrease support of Eurosceptic, populist, radical parties in the regions affected. So with this paper, we contribute and link two strands of the literature. There is already a couple of papers looking into the economic impacts of regional policies. And specifically, there's quite some papers by Sascha Becker with varying co-authors that have looked into the economic impacts of these European regional development funds. And on average, they find that these investments contribute to regional growth and to employment. And our question here is whether this also has political consequences. On the other hand, and David already summarized this, we have this literature on the economic causes of populisms that usually show that macroeconomic developments cause regional inequalities, and that specifically regions lacking behind in economic development tend to support populist parties. And here the question most obviously is whether regional policies may act as remedy for this development. So finally, the research question is whether the economic impacts of regional policies we know from the literature translate into decreasing populist support. I should mention that we are not the very first to look into this issue. Specifically, there's two related papers, one on the UK and one on Italy, that also look into voting effects of European Regional Development Funds investments. Our results are much in line with the findings of Albanese and co-author. They are not so much in line with the findings of Crescenzi and co-authors. So this is just in a nutshell the whole research setup. We look as an outcome, so the variable that is affected. This is the vote shares of left or right extreme parties gained in European parliamentary elections. We observe these outcomes on the NUTS2 level. NUTS is, the whole NUTS system is a classification system used by the European Union to classify classify regions, and NUTS3 is the smallest level they have here. NUTS3 in Germany would correspond to counties, to Landkreise. And we code all European parties that ever contribute, that ever participated in these elections into left fringe, right fringe, according to the populist. That is a project conducted, international project conducted by various political scientists that really went through all the party programs of European parties and allowed us to classify parties left fringe, right fringe. And we look into the impact of ERDF spending, European Regional Development Fund spending. The ERDF is the second largest European single project after the Agrarian Fund, and it has several project lines that are all meant to support regional development. For us, and over the period we observed, most important is what was originally framed Objective 1, that is a funding line that is meant to support regional development and regional convergence of backwatered regions. The European Union defines the eligibility of certain regions for funding under this objective, and this then allows to pursue larger regional policy projects within this region. Importantly, the funding from the European Union always has to be accompanied by funding by either the national governments or regional authorities, or even the private sector. So it's really a huge program. You see, we observe 3 funding periods. The ERDF always funds over 7 years. There's a period 2000-2006, 2007 to 2013, 2014 to 2020. This should read, and there's huge amounts spent, and this is only the funds spent by the European Union. This is then co-financed by national funds. And within each of these funding periods, we observe at least one one European election, and the question is whether the election results of these European elections are affected by the funding. This is just some descriptive maps on the vote shares achieved by far-right parties in the consecutive elections. You see 2004, 2009, 2019. You see darker blue means higher vote shares, and you see that over time the vote shares of right-fringe parties spreads. So more and more countries see right-fringe parties on the ballot, and overall also the support for these parties increases. You see that there's a stark national component. There are certain countries like Poland where these fringe parties really get a lot of votes, and there's countries like Spain where they gain significantly less vote. What our econometric model does, it accounts for these differences between countries. It accounts for differences for instance, in labor market developments or in population density that has nothing to do with structural funds. And this is what this last map here is supposed to show you. If we clean the data for all these other influences that have not so much to do with funding or with regional policies, this is the variation we then in the very end exploit in our empirical model. And we can do the same for left-wing parties, but I'm not going to talk about this into detail. And if we now just start and relate as a starting point the vote share achieved by far-right parties, this is here in the upper part, or by far-left parties, and relate this just to the funds received by the regions. Regions are the blue dots. From the European Development Funds, we see that there's a negative correlation for right-wing parties. The more funds a region receives, the lower the support for these right-wing parties is. And for the left, we see an opposite relationship. There, the higher the funds region receives is, the higher the support for the left-wing parties is. However, this only tells us that there's a statistical relationship. More funds means lower support for populist parties or for right-wing populist parties. But these differences could be driven by many things. Yeah. In the very end, we compare regions here on the right-hand side that get high transfers with regions here that get low transfers, and these are very different regions. Yeah, these are cities versus backwatered regions. These are perhaps regions with a very capable local administration that is able to extract these funds, versus regions where the administration is not that capable. So it's very difficult to say, just on the basis of this data, whether the decrease in support for right-wing populists is indeed driven by these regional policies or by some other factors underlying the distribution of these funds, by some other regional factors. And to now really make a clear statement whether the reduction of the vote share for the right-wing parties is driven by this specific regional policy. In the paper, we exploit some additional sources of variation that should help us to compare more similar regions. And just to give you an impression for our most important or our baseline approach, this whole thing exploits the criteria by which the European Union decides which regions to fund. And the European Union here follows a clear rule. It says that if a region has a GDP per capita that is lower than 75% of the European average, it gets funding. And if a region has a GDP per capita that is higher than the 75% average, it is not eligible for funding. And you see, if you look here at the dots, that this is not perfectly followed the rule. It's not perfectly followed this rule. This is something you can correct for with the statistical model. The basic idea for this identification is that there is a strict rule. And of course, these very poor regions here are difficult to compare to the very rich regions here. But that right around this threshold of 75%, this threshold is a little bit arbitrary, right? So if you compare a region that has 74% of the European average to a region that has 76% of the European average, they are not substantially different in the regional development. It is just by chance that the threshold is set in the middle between those regions, and it's just this threshold that separates the region receiving treatment from the region not receiving treatment. And this is something you can exploit in statistical models to say something about whether differences between those two regions are in the very end caused by the structural development funds. Indeed, if you look at the here, it comes out clearer. Here I have plotted the funds received by the treated versus the untreated regions according to the specific rule. It's important to note that also those very rich regions get some money. Yeah, it's the European Union. Everybody gets some money, but you have a steep and very discrete increase in the funds that go into these regions around the 75% threshold. For those of you who are into econometrics, we run a fuzzy regression discontinuity design parametric approach where we include higher order polynomials of the forcing variables and allow this to vary between both sides of the threshold. For those of you who are not so much into econometrics, the results I show you now only exploit the variation that comes from the sudden and steep increase in the level of funds. It distracts from these differences between very poor and somewhat poor regions and very rich and somewhat rich regions. All the results I show you now are driven by this sudden jump here that is caused by this eligibility rule. And if you use this and regress the vote share right-wing parties receive in the European elections on this increase in funds that is caused by this threshold, and let's focus on this single estimate here, you see that consistently regions that receive funding under this objective one show lower support for right-wing parties. And to give you an idea of the estimate, so actually this estimate here would tell you that receiving funds from the ERDF decreases support of right fringe parties by 2.9 percentage points. If you now know that on average, these far right parties receive 14.6% in the European elections we observed here. This means that instead of receiving 14.6%, the average region would receive 11.7% if they were treated, which corresponds to a decrease in support for far-right parties by 99%, which is an upper bound. If I look at all the estimates we have, I feel comfortable in saying that funding by the ERDF decreases support of far-right parties by around 15%. We don't find any effect on the left fringe if we do this causal estimates here. So the correlations we see at the very beginning, they vanish consistently when we employ more sophisticated statistical models. So the conclusion is that ERDF spending decreases support for far-right parties, but not for far-left parties. I skip this in the interest of time, and I just give you an impression of what else we do. So one way to assessing this effect is looking into this 75% threshold. This then identifies from similarly poor regions in the very end, but we can identify the effect also by other means. One way to look at the whole thing is to focus on all the regions in red that receive funding. And then in 2004, we had the EU Eastern enlargement. And just due to the fact that suddenly so many comparatively poor regions joined the Union, the average GDP decreased, which means that there were regions here in blue, for instance, in East Germany, that received funding and were relatively poor as compared to other European regions, suddenly fell out of the treatment just because poorer regions joined the Union. It is not that they develop economically, it's not that they experience huge growth, it is just by poorer regions joining the Union that they suddenly dropped out of treatment. This is another source of variation you can look at, how these regions that drop out perform as compared to the regions that stay in. And if you look into the effect of dropping out of the funding, you see that losing funding significantly increases the support of far-right parties, thus giving additional evidence that indeed this funding has a causal impact on support of populist parties. And just to show you that we really carefully thought about the whole thing, a final way to look at the whole issue is to exploit the very fact that whether a region receives funding or not is defined on the NUTS 2 level. That's a higher level of regional aggregation. And I marked this here in blue. This whole region would be eligible for funding or not. But within these regions, these larger regions that receive funding, you time and again find NUTS 3 regions, smaller units that for themselves would be rich enough not to receive funding. So this region here, whatever color that is, this region here only receives funding because its neighbors are so poor. So we could call these as exogenously treated. And the same you find in the larger regions that do not receive funding. In these larger regions that do not receive funding, you find the one or the other region that is per se so poor that it would qualify for funding, if just their neighbors would not be so rich. And again, using these regions that just receive funding because the neighbors are so poor, or that just receive funding because don't receive funding because the neighbors are so rich. If we use this again to estimate the effect, again, we find when we match these regions to comparable regions from the same country, that receiving the funding significantly decreases the support of far-right parties. Just one last slide with results, and then I'll conclude. We wanted to understand better where this results comes from. Why do voters decide to decrease support of populist parties. And for doing so, we looked at survey data from the Eurobarometer. With the Eurobarometer, individuals in all European countries are frequently asked a couple of questions on their attitudes towards the European Union and on their attitudes towards democracy and stuff. And if you plot this, you see two things. In the regions where far-right parties are particularly successful, have high vote shares, the European Union has a particularly negative image. And in regions that have where the vote share of far parties is particularly high, people are very dissatisfied with democracy in the European Union. And you can look at other things. What we now do is we repeat our initial estimates and see whether these attitudes to the European Union or other stuff change with receiving funding. And you see that in regions that receive funding, people are significantly more likely to say that the European Union is beneficial for their country. They are also more satisfied with life. Interestingly, they are not so much more optimistic when it comes to their personal economic situation or when it comes to their job perspective. So there seems to be something that the overall mood is better, although the own economic perspectives are not necessarily evaluated better. We don't necessarily see that the European Union has a more positive image in the regions that receive funding, but the European Union has a significantly less negative image. So there is something that this strong discontent and this frustration with the European Union seems to decrease when regions receive funding, although this does not necessarily translate into overall very, very positive image with the European Union, so not necessarily more identification. We see that the satisfaction with democracy in the European Union increases, not so much the satisfaction with democracy per se or with satisfaction in the country. So there seems to be something very European specific in this transmission from receiving funding by the European Union to decreasing support for these right-wing populist Eurosceptic parties. And again, we see that the trust, and there's a couple of questions on that, in European institutions increased, not so much the trust in national institutions, again hinting at the fact that voters deliberately increase their support or are more satisfied with the European Union if they receive funds from the ERDF. So to conclude, regional policies do indeed decrease populist support, and in fact exclusively works on the right fringe of the political spectrum. Simultaneously, the investments decrease the discontent with the European Union and increase the trust in democratic institutions. We don't yet really know which of the single policy measures are most important here. I think more research is needed to better understand that. And I still don't know whether it's a good idea to put up these signs whenever somebody of you finds a data set that tells you something about the location of the signs. I would be very interested in that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you a lot, Robert. And now with this very EU perspective first, I will hand over to Matthias Diermeier, who will talk very shortly, because I think he has to go a little earlier, about the German perspective on this similar issue. Especially, he's head of research of the unit Democracy, Society and Market Economy at the German Economic Institute, Institut der Deutschen Wirtschaft in Cologne. And they have written reports with a focus on Germany and the AfD in the last federal elections, and also the recent state elections in Hessen and Bavaria. And as I understand it, it's more on the diagnosis part of where populism comes from, especially also with this focus on which regions are affected most. So please, Matthias, I hand over.
Oh, thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Robert, for this spectacular study. I would like to add maybe a little nuance for Germany. So you right now focused on these rather deprived regions, and particularly if we would look to Germany, then there's very few of them who are below the 75% threshold. However, what we try to focus on is regions that are performing rather well, but they are kind of struggled, they're kind of distressed in dealing with climate change policy and the transition policies more in general. So we've seen during the last 2 years, basically, the transition policies and explicitly the energy price hike, they've turned climate policies into a bit of the fourth wheel of mobilization and success for populist radical right-wing parties, and also specifically to the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. So sort of these policies fit very well into the meta story that something is unrightfully taken away from a deserving in-group by a deserving out-group. So the citizens in the specific regions are sort of heard by policymakers out there in the capital or far away in Brussels, possibly. And we add this like much less elaborate but interesting empirical nugget, namely that climate skepticism has become a trigger point to mobilize voters, and that this works best in regions where ecological transformation actually puts a lot at stake. So my colleagues identified regions in Germany that are particularly dependent on the labor market in traditional combustion engine like automotive manufacturing, and also where these CO2 intense industries are sitting: steel industry, cement industry, glass industry, and chemistry industry. And for a long time, we've always seen this correlation, particularly for Germany. If we look regionally on AfD success, that we see that where manufacturing is based, AfD turns out stronger. So now we can come up with a so again, these are rather prosperous regions, right? These are regions that are heavily dependent on these like export markets with well-paid jobs, with rather low unemployment rates and high incomes. But, and if we look at our survey data, then this is where people are very much concerned about the future, and particularly regarding how the transition is supposed to happen in their region. And if we look at the federal election 2021 and we look to Western Germany, then we see no big difference. So the AfD performs 1 percentage points better in these transformation regions, as we classified them, than in the rest. However, if we look at Bavaria now, this margin goes up to 3 percentage points. And if we look to Hesse, this margin goes up to 3 percentage points. And also if we compare the performance of the AfD against the performance of the Green Party, then we see that in Bavaria, the AfD wins in transformation regions by 5 percentage points. However, the Greens win in the non-transformation areas by 2.5%. And in Hesse, the margin is even 10 percentage points. So we really see this polarization, this like regional specific polarization in these specific areas that are heavily dependent on the manufacturing sector. So coming back to Robert Gold's presentation a bit, what we find is very much in line with the general research on populist radical right-wing parties that was already mentioned, namely that welfare policies per se might not help to come back to counter these movements and parties. However, a very solid socio-tropical environment might help, and regional policies, particularly if they are successful in helping the transition of regions, are crucial. So we need to be very much aware of the political implication of what potentially happens if we do not find these regional policy tools that will enable these manufacturing sectors on their transition to a net zero economy in the end. And we need to be very much aware of how distressed people in these regions are. And maybe that's the last interesting empirical point and then I'll stop. The AfD people are the ones the least certain that money will help to secure a societal support in the climate change. So they are the ones who do not ask for more money because they feel that it's an ideological question that is opposed on them. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Matthias. In the light of that you have to leave a little bit early, I would just directly give Robert Gauld the opportunity to respond right away before handing over to Catherine Fieschi, who has accepted to comment on the presentation. And yeah, so I just want to hand over to you, Robert, again. Maybe you could say how you reconcile these two, maybe at first sight, a little bit different results for Germany. Yeah, please.
Yeah, these are interesting insights. Thanks, Matthias. And most obviously, the question about green or ecological transformation seems to be the new dividing line between populists, not only in Germany, but also across the world, and somewhat like the democratic mainstream. It's interesting to see that you also find this in the regional data. To qualify one thing here, I mean, this specific set of regional policies reduces support for populist parties, but not to zero, right? So, I mean, as I said, the effect measures is something like a 15% decrease on average, and there is effect heterogeneity, and specifically those poor regions benefiting from ERDF investments still are very supportive of populist parties as compared to others, right? So you have a reduction if you invest into the regions. But still, these backwarded regions are strongholds, and of course, there's not the one single factor that explains populist support, but it's a compendium of economic distress, psychological factors, ideological factors, and I think this is a specificity of populist parties, that they are so very successful in binding together all these different issues into a, well, at least for their supporters, a kind of compelling narrative that there is some green globalist elite that acts in their own interest, but not in the interest of the people. So I don't even think that the results somehow contradict each other. I think this issue about attitudes towards green transition and depending on the industry structure just complements this regional study. In the very end, it's important to know, I think, as a common denominator, that there's a strong regional dimension in the support of populist parties, and that there's a strong regional disparities in how much people support populist parties, and better understanding the reasons for this, I think, really helps to improve regional policies or other policy measures that might help to tackle the issue.
Thank you. So now I will hand over to Catherine Fieschi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
You are, and I'm very surprised because no one ever does.
Okay, I'm glad.
So thank you.
Yeah, I would just shortly introduce you as well. You're now the fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute, and you're a comparative political analyst with a focus on populism, authoritarianism, and challenges to democracy and representation in general. And you're also the author of the great book, Populocracy, The Tyranny of Authenticity and the Rise of Populism, which was published in 2019. So I'm very glad that you will commenting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for asking me. It was a bit last minute, so I'm just going to react to the the papers. But first of all, I want to thank you, both Robert and Matthias for your studies. I'm somebody who has tended to look at all the other factors as well as economics, but I've emphasized the other factors, and I've often been frustrated by a very narrow definition of what is an economic impact. And so, I really like the approach that you've taken, that takes a broader assessment of what economic impact might mean. So just a few points that I think are worth raising. One is the point I think about the Green Deal, which and environmental policy, which I hadn't really planned on raising, but Matthias, you make a very valid point. It's something that when I was director of Counterpoint, we worked on 4 or 5 years ago, and saw this start to rival the narratives and the framing of immigration as the other potential mobilizing factor. And of course, it's a new dividing line, and at the same time, as you've both underscored, it works in a sense through the same dynamics. People who are disconnected from people's everyday lives somewhere in Brussels, making decisions without any kind of real knowledge of how it's going to impact the lives of ordinary people. And you both discussed Germany. This is also very true in France, and in different regions of France. Since Robert, you've looked at this regional dimension so thoroughly. So it's interesting that you have regions that are wealthier, and so you have in fact a more prosperous population turning right. And what that's actually giving is not necessarily that they're turning to the populist right of, say, Marine Le Pen, for example. But what it's done is it's created a reservoir of votes that has created temptation for the mainstream center right to actually drift further toward the populist right to capture these voters. And we see this in various regions dotted across France. And then, of course, there's a region like the East toward Strasbourg, which has suffered massive deindustrialization. And here, what we see is a vote for the populist right, because voters don't really want, just as they're starting to get their bearings again, they don't want a new wave of policies wiping out what essentially is carbon-driven industries. And these voters on the East will be voting more, I think, for the right-wing populists, along the lines of what Matthias outlines. Just a couple of quick points. One is on EU funds, and it made me think of that sign that you referred to, Robert. And we sometimes you see some of these on American highways, your tax dollar hard at work, the same kind of putting forward of this messaging. I'm wondering what kind of other messaging some of these EU regional funds come with, right? That help to frame this into and it might account for that situation where people don't necessarily feel positive about the European Union, but might feel less negative about the European Union. And so I'm wondering what kind of messaging goes with that, and whether it mediates those effects that you're talking about. But I think that what I'm most interested in are the two following points. One is, and I know that you hinted that you're going to be doing research on this, is what kind of funding has this kind of impact? This is what this I suppose is what I'm most interested in. It reminds me, in the run-up to the referendum in the UK, my group carried out a lot of research in some of the more deprived regions, lots of focus groups and conversation groups with voters who had already declared that they were going to vote in favor of Brexit. And one of the things that we always tested with them was this idea that, a lot of research showed that, they might be poorer as a result. And we consistently got, I wouldn't say in 100% of cases, but in 90% of the conversations, what the voters or the citizens said to us was a version of, we don't really care as long as we're a community again. And so it's something that's always made me wonder about, the kind of impact that we're looking for when these funds get spent. And my sense is, or my hunch is from, a lot of these conversations, that what these people want is a set of policies that might create, a sense of belonging to something, belonging to a community, belonging to, even an industry or a sector, rather than necessarily money in their pocket. And Martin Sandbu, in his book, The Economics of Belongings, makes a very good point, about the kinds of jobs that might be created, through different kinds of spending policies. So I guess my point here is, is it that people feel that they have, a little bit more money or are being treated better? Or is it that the impact of this money is actually creating community ties? And so it's not so much that they resent being left behind as much as they resent being left alone. And there's, there is kind of a difference here. And, final question, therefore, is whether, whether Bidenomics is going to deliver on this in some of these particularly deprived areas. Is it going to not just deliver prosperity, but actually the kind of prosperity that creates the communities that people seem to be aspiring to? So kind of community is as a variable that mediates between the two.
So Robert, I think you have some very good questions.
Yeah. No, these are excellent questions, and I think the concrete answer to specifically the last questions, what's more important, receiving funds or this identity things, also feeling like a community again. To better know this, one would have to look much more closer in the concrete projects that are funded on site. And within this project, we cannot do this. That's just too, that's really a variety of stuff. And I think one would really have to, this is something one would have to look into closer in country study, I guess, to get also more relevant information. Still, I think there's the one or the other thing when I read a little bit between the lines. Yeah, this is, I don't have a clear answer to each and everything, but you ask about the messaging of the funds and how this works. And what exactly the mechanisms are. So exactly, I don't know. But one, they don't only put up these signs, but there is a lot of reporting on investments by these funds in the local newspapers and each and everything, in the local radio and TV. I think it's what's I think socialists. Come on. Sociologists call salient. It's for people living in these regions. It's very apparent that projects are being conducted. And from the regressions we ran, first of all, it seems that the very fact that I receive money is more important than the amount of money I receive. So it's just the very fact that regional policies are being conducted already have the impact. And then the size of the project within the specific framework, and these are all huge projects, within a specific project does not matter that much anymore. And looking into the individual level results, my impression very much is that I think it goes a little bit into your direction. It's more that you're not left behind anymore. Yeah, that there is somebody who cares for this region. That this seems to be, this is my interpretation of the results. It's an interpretation that this is the driving force. Just the very fact that there are attempts to stop the decline of these regions and to put them on a development trajectory. This is in line with not finding any impacts on the individual prospects of these individuals. They don't think that they will be better off these questions. Yeah, they are don't think that they will be better off next year, or their jobs will be more secure. But nevertheless, they are more satisfied with their overall life in this region, and bring these things together. I think this is it. Which policies actually drive this, or which exactly are more supportive? I don't know. That's something one would have to look into closer. And I think it's a super interesting question, and it would be worthwhile doing this. We won't do this within this project here, though.
I would have a question, because I remind in the paper, when you do this excellent, very important exercise to compare the impact of regions who have, or to see the impact for regions who have dropped out of the policies in the EU funds after the enlargement of the EU, and I hope that these numbers haven't changed in the last round, because, but as I understood this impact, you said that the impact was that those regions who dropped out had some negative impact, or some, the right-wing votes, far-right votes went up again. But if I remember correctly, the enlargement was in 2004, and if I remember correctly, the numbers in your paper, it has not been seen in the numbers in the outcome of the elections in 2009 yet, but only in 2014 fully. What does that mean? I mean, the enlargement was in 2004. The next period of EU budget was starting in 2007, so it was not before. But still, there were some years between. What are the lessons you would turn? Is that correct? And the second question would be, what are the lessons to learn? What can that learn us on the impact, on the way this impacts, and on the delays?
I shared the slide again, okay? So this is very much this picture here, right, where you have these blue regions that suddenly drop out of the treatment. And the huge wave of enlargement was in 2004, which means that after 2004, for the next funding period, they dropped out. In 2004, these regions still received funding. And this here tells you that during this period where they still received funding, they do not differ in their voting behavior from the others. So in the period where everybody gets funding between 1999 and 2004, there's no difference in the voting behavior between those regions that stay in the treatment and those that drop out later on. So this whole set of regions we look at, the blue plus the red regions, are statistically the same in the voting behavior before anything changes. And it is just after these blue regions drop out that they differ in their voting behavior from the red regions. So this is just a test here. This not finding an effect is just a test that there is no unobserved regional heterogeneity that drives the results. This just tells you that before dropping out, they indeed have the same voting outcome statistically, and just after dropping out, these regions differ. And this is between the next two periods, you have an effect that the right-wing parties score 1 percentage point more, and it increases over the period of time. This non-effect, it just tells you that the identification approach works, that regions that were similar before suddenly after dropping out diverge, and that those that drop out then turn to supporting the right-wing populists. Does this make things clear?
Not fully, because I remember that in the paper you said that the full impact is only seen in 2014, wasn't it? Or maybe
yeah, sure. I mean, it then accumulates, specifically since you have additional rounds of enlargement. So this is the very initial. Okay, let's go back here on this timeline. Where have I had this timeline somewhere? Yeah, exactly. So you have the funding periods up here, and you have the elections down here, right? So, and we have an Eastern enlargement in 2004. Nothing happens in this funding period. It is in this funding period, in the second one, where then regions drop out. That is, you observe an effect between 2004 and 2009. And it is right that those regions who drop out between those two periods in time that drive the result, they still get some funding in this period here. So the program was that they were compensated for their losses. They did not went down to zero, so to say, but there was an interim solution that in this funding period here, for those who dropped out, there were specific funds to finish regional development projects. So the full effect, so reducing the funding to zero, so to say, can only observed here in 2019, because in this third funding period, they really dropped to zero. So dropping out, if you look at this map again, dropping out blue means no effect for the 2004 election. For the 2009 election, one might expect some effect, but it's still buffered by additional funds dedicated for these blue regions. And only from 2014 on, there is the full impact when they really fully drop out. Yeah, and this is what you see here. So the 2004 election is not affected, and it should not be affected. In the 2009 election, where they still get some funding, you measure an effect. But here in the 2014 election, when the funding is really reduced to zero, the effect even increases. So this is just consistent with losing funding increases support of right fringe parties.
I was just wondering if there's any indication in any of the results about the delays between getting funding and having voting results correspondingly, which could help to understand the mechanisms behind.
Well, here it's more closely linked to the share of the loss, or the amount of the loss. Little loss has a little impact, large loss has a large impact. But otherwise, with delays, I mean, all the elections take place at the same time. So you cannot say much about delays here.
Okay. Are there any further questions from the audience? I think not for the moment. I would perhaps just ask some, which is more prospective on what Catherine also said on things like Bidenomics or other things. I mean, I understand that this study was perfectly done and so excellent because there were European-wide results for both sides, and so it was quite easy. Are there other ways how you would try to continue to sort out the impact of regional development on electoral and on populism? Is there anything, or Catherine, where the way next steps could be going to?
Well, this has given me lots of ideas, particularly as Robert was clear on what he wasn't going to be doing in this project. I'd love to delve deeper, on the basis of what you've already done, and therefore, working with your data, looking at how we could compartmentalize, the different spending and the different impacts. And I'm not aware of whether or not there is, I mean, obviously there will be a lot of studies on regional spending in the US, given its obvious structure, but I'm not aware of any studies that have taken a granular approach like this to see, you know, what kind of spending has what kind of impacts, particularly on those key states that Biden needs to secure. It would be really interesting to see if this is being done, because my sense is that, you know, as a direct result of the IRA, there will be frantic measurement and measuring going on in terms of the impact. I know that that's being done. I just don't know whether it's being aggregated yet. But I do hope that we could, you know, look at that more specifically and see if, you know, A, will be interesting as a prospective tool, and B, it would tell us something, obviously, you know, about the cultural welfare, cultures of welfare, of receipt, you know, and all of these intervening variables that shape the kind of impacts that you've tracked, Robert. I think it would be, you know, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. So specifically for the US, I mean, this would now be the super interesting thing to know. The IRA itself, as far as I understand it, doesn't have a regional dimension. But nevertheless, of course, by the industries selected, by the concrete measures selected, it will benefit some regions more than others. And specifically, it will benefit those regions who suffered from trade integration. There's this China shock paper, these regions that lost so much manufacturing employment. It should benefit these regions a lot. And if we can generalize these results we have here on Europe to the US, then it should help and it should work. And it will be super interesting to see that. I mean, otherwise, here, based on the European data, as already said, it would be helpful, specifically with respect to policy design, to know more about the concrete policies pursued on ground. And from the last funding period on, the European Union publishes very detailed information on the specific projects funded and on the specific co-financing that has been done. So there are avenues still. My impression is that to do it properly, one would have to rather concentrate on single countries. And another thing, if you ask about prospects, this is not a joke. I think I personally would be very interested in the specific effect of these signs, because also just some anecdotal evidence from the Brexit referendum, and Dennis Novi, he conducted from Warwick University, he also conducted a lot of after poll surveys, and here's a story in Lincolnshire in front of the town hall. There was the polling station, huge sign outside this building was erected with funds from the European Union. And then he asked one of these guys, how did you vote? Yeah, leave. Yeah, why? Yeah, what has the European Union ever done for us? And he said, yeah, look at the sign. Yeah, he said, yeah, but I want our government to spend our money on our region. And I mean, if there is, I don't know, but I'm still fascinated by this idea that if it's too obvious that the European Union is active, people might understand it as kind of I don't know, infringement or again, these bureaucrats intermingling with your regional stuff. Our results now do not hint in this direction, but I wonder if it's there. And I think this is also something related to the policies, perhaps the concrete policies. It's a matter of political communication of these things. If there is something to learn apart from the concrete policies, also with respect to how these policies are communicated, under which circumstances they have the strongest impact on populist support.
Okay, there's one very technical specific question in the chat from Julia Moiser, asking if there's any discussion at EU level to review and refine the NUTS structure to enable work done at individual community levels. Don't know if there's a simple answer. Otherwise, or you may hint at it afterwards. Otherwise, I would like to thank you for your participation. Also, Catherine, I mean, we just spontaneously had the idea, as you were interested in, that you can very spontaneously also comment without being, when we didn't have a formal commentator structure this time.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
And just to mention, and just to say, I mean, probably David has pronounced your name correctly, because I don't know if I'm right now, but he's in Rome at the moment, in Italy. So he's very under the influence of Italian. So maybe that's the reason, and I'm very happy to have learned that. And Robert, thanks a lot for this paper and for the work, and we will continue to work on all this. The paper is not yet finished, so it's not yet in a version that can be published or sent around, but we have shared the presentation on the link that you've seen in the chat, and you will find it on our website. You will always, as always, find the relive of this session on our website. So if you have any friends or colleagues you would like to hint to and have a look at this discussion, this excellent discussion, please feel free. So thanks a lot and have a good afternoon. Thanks, David, for having helped to moderate and introduce the speakers, and see you soon.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks for the nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.